I never saw the threat. Not crooks, but grinning colleagues. I'm Adam, entering New York's Investigation Bureau, a stranger in a slick machine. The office, polished yet cold, buzzed with hostility. My early transfer sparked whispers. Eyes watched, some curious, others wary. Brandon and Chris stood out, suits sharp, oozing privilege. Trust fund cops, thriving on connections, not skill. Brandon's smile hid calculation. "Star detective, huh?" he jabbed. Chris smirked, eyeing me like prey. "Good to meet you," I replied, masking unease. Their game soon showed. Files vanished, meetings shifted unannounced. Searching for a lost report, I heard Chris sneer, "Needs a map." Their laughs stung, but I stayed cool, slamming the cabinet. Things moved funny. Alone, I saw their war to break me, fearing I'd expose their sham. I never thought the biggest threat I'd face wasn't criminals, but the colleagues smiling right next to me. When I first stepped foot into the Central Investigation Bureau in New York, I felt like a foreign object forced into an ecosystem already perfectly balanced without me. The office, neatly arranged yet sterile, buzzed quietly with an undercurrent of tension. My transfer here, months ahead of the usual schedule, had sparked enough chatter and whispers long before my arrival. Setting my small cardboard box onto the tidy desk assigned to me, I subtly scanned the room. People glanced my way, some openly curious, others deliberately avoiding eye contact. But among them all, two figures immediately caught my attention. Brandon and Chris stood off to one side, coffee cups in hand, perfectly tailored suits, an air of casual entitlement surrounding them. I'd heard plenty about them, both products of wealthy families, their careers shaped less by skill and more by privilege. Brandon approached first, a wide, practiced smile plastered across his face. "So, you must be Adam," he said, extending a hand firmly. His voice was warm, but his eyes held a careful calculation. Behind him, Chris remained silent, watching me closely, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "That's me," I answered evenly, returning his handshake with a practiced calm. "Good to finally put faces to names." He laughed softly, but the humor didn't reach his eyes. "Same here. You know, everyone's been curious about the star detective from upstate. Impressive record, especially getting here this quickly." His emphasis on quickly hung between us like a veiled accusation. I nodded briefly, forcing an indifferent smile. "Just doing my job." In the following days, the subtle hostility grew increasingly apparent. Brandon and Chris seemed friendly enough outwardly, yet beneath their polished veneer, I sensed the quiet resentment. Documents critical to my first cases mysteriously vanished, only to reappear later, placed in locations I would never use. Meetings would change suddenly without anyone informing me, leaving me scrambling at the last minute. One afternoon, as I searched the office cabinets for a crucial piece of evidence that had inexplicably moved, I overheard Chris's low, amused voice behind me. "Looks like our new detective needs a GPS to find his files," he whispered to Brandon. Their soft laughter prickled the back of my neck, sharp and deliberate, but I pretended not to hear. Instead, I calmly located the missing document and closed the cabinet slowly, turning around with steady composure. "Seems things are finding their own places around here," I said, my voice mild but clear enough for them to understand the message beneath. Chris raised an eyebrow mockingly, feigning innocence. "Strange how things work, huh?" That evening, alone at my apartment, I replayed every interaction carefully, analyzing each word, every subtle gesture. Brandon and Chris's behavior wasn't merely about envy. It was rooted deeper, entrenched in their fear of being overshadowed, exposed for their mediocrity. Their careers depended entirely on carefully woven connections rather than merit. And my sudden presence here threatened to unravel everything they'd built through privilege rather than skill. As I stared at the shadowed ceiling above, I knew this was only the beginning. My instincts, sharpened through years of investigative work, whispered clearly, The tension I felt wasn't just harmless office politics. It was the calm before the storm, a storm that could destroy everything I'd fought so hard to achieve. After those initial, uncomfortable encounters, things didn't get easier. They became increasingly complex and subtle, transforming my everyday working life into a high-stakes psychological game. About 2 weeks into my tenure, an email from Director David arrived abruptly, informing the entire bureau about a new restructuring plan. Due to budget constraints, there would soon be staff reductions based strictly on performance metrics. This announcement instantly changed the atmosphere in the office, from casual competition to a tangible and sharp-edged anxiety. I noticed Brandon and Chris immediately tense up, their usually composed faces briefly betraying panic before quickly resuming their carefully managed masks. The very next day, as I arrived early to review notes from an ongoing investigation, I discovered the most critical witness statement missing from my desk. I searched quietly but thoroughly. Nothing. I sensed someone approaching and looked up just in time to see Brandon leaning casually against the doorway, a steaming coffee cup held loosely in his hand. "Lose something, Adam?" Brandon asked, feigning innocent concern, though his eyes glittered with suppressed amusement. "Just some notes," I replied neutrally, carefully hiding my frustration. "I must have misplaced them." He smirked slightly, stepping closer. "Careful, Adam. Small mistakes add up, especially when everyone's under the microscope." I stared steadily into his eyes until he turned away, confident, carefree, as if he'd already scored a point. My fists clenched involuntarily, but I released them, forcing composure. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate sabotage. Within days, another incident followed. An important briefing about the restructuring was inexplicably moved forward, leaving me uninformed and unprepared. I entered the meeting room 20 minutes late, greeted by icy silence and disapproving stares. At the head of the table, Director David said nothing, but his cold, judgmental gaze lingered on me, heavy with implicit rebuke. Brandon and Chris exchanged satisfied glances, clearly pleased by my discomfort. After the meeting, as I lingered near my office door, Chris intentionally raised his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Seems like our rising star's starting to dim a bit," he remarked casually to Brandon, his voice dripping with condescension. Fighting down a surge of anger, I maintained my composure, turning away before they could see the effect of their words. It became clear these weren't isolated incidents, but part of a systematic attempt to undermine me. They were responding to the existential threat posed by the restructuring, desperate to preserve their privileged positions. Other colleagues began to subtly avoid interactions with me, choosing cautious neutrality over potential involvement. Conversations would abruptly cease when I approached, and casual smiles turned strained, hesitant. This isolation added another layer of tension, pressing heavily on me. Determined not to become a victim, I quietly devised a plan to confirm my suspicions. Late one night, I deliberately placed a misleading document, carefully fabricated to appear critical, on my desk, leaving it just slightly exposed, appearing carelessly abandoned. I knew if my instincts were correct, this would be irresistible bait. The following afternoon, Brandon confidently proposed investigative tactics strangely aligned with the false leads I'd intentionally outlined in that fabricated document. As he presented his innovative ideas during a team meeting, I watched silently, inwardly confirming my suspicions with grim satisfaction. Yet beneath that triumph lay a sinking feeling, the realization that the depth of their resentment was dangerously profound. Later that evening, working alone, I caught sight of Director David moving silently through the office corridor, his sharp eyes briefly connecting with mine through the open door. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity of his gaze unsettled me deeply. I sensed clearly, this wasn't just scrutiny, it was evaluation. He was quietly assessing me, measuring my ability to withstand pressure and navigate internal conflict. I suddenly realized my performance wasn't merely judged on how well I solved cases, but how adeptly I managed this internal threat as well. As I finally closed up the office that night, I stood alone in the quiet darkness, absorbing the silence. This wasn't just office politics or personal envy. This was a deeply calculated psychological war. The realization settled heavily over me. I wasn't just fighting to maintain my career. I was fighting to preserve who I was, to protect my integrity from the insidious threats hidden behind friendly smiles and carefully chosen words. Walking out into the night, I resolved firmly. I would no longer remain passive. From now on, each step forward required not just caution, but strategy. The real battle had only just begun. The pressure inside the bureau had escalated to an almost unbearable intensity. Each day felt heavier than the last, with the threat of restructuring hanging ominously over everyone's heads. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for the depth of betrayal awaiting me. It was a frigid, overcast Thursday morning when Director David abruptly summoned us for an urgent briefing. The room filled quickly, a somber tension enveloping each person. David stood at the front, his presence commanding, his expression unusually severe. Behind him, the screen flickered alive, displaying a notorious drug lord we'd hunted relentlessly for months, recently spotted near the city's outskirts. "This case is critical," David declared firmly, his eyes briefly locking onto mine. "Immediate action is mandatory. Adam, Brandon, Chris, you'll handle this directly." I caught the fleeting look between Brandon and Chris. Brief, loaded with hidden meaning, discomfort masked swiftly behind professional nods. As the meeting concluded, something nagged persistently at my subconscious. Why had David specifically grouped me with these two, knowing the tensions between us? Nonetheless, duty prevailed. We geared up silently, heading towards the dense, isolated woodland region, the suspect's last known whereabouts. Brandon and Chris moved with unusual cooperation, guiding me confidently toward the area. My instincts, honed from years of investigative work, rang loudly. Something felt deeply off. Midway into the operation, Brandon stopped suddenly, gesturing urgently toward an overgrown side path branching sharply away from our original route. "I saw movement down here," he whispered convincingly. Chris instantly backed him up, nodding in urgent agreement. Reluctantly, I followed, heart racing with quiet suspicion. The path twisted deeper into isolation, the thick forest closing around us like a trap. The further we moved from the planned route, the clearer my suspicion became. "Stop!" I finally snapped, halting abruptly. Brandon and Chris turned, confusion briefly flickering in their eyes before quickly replaced with guarded hostility. "We're completely off route," I stated firmly, eyes locked onto Brandon. "What's going on here?" Chris stepped forward, his eyes burning with resentment. "You don't see it, Adam? You stroll into our bureau, threaten our positions, and expect everything to go smoothly?" "Enough," Brandon added sharply, stepping closer. "You've pushed us into this corner." Tension exploded in a burst of sudden movement. Chris lunged, violently shoving me into a tree trunk, pain jolting sharply through my spine. I swung back defensively, attempting to regain control, but Brandon was already upon me, fists flying, face twisted with desperation and anger. In a chaotic blur of motion, I caught sight of Chris grasping a large stone from the ground. My heart froze as realization dawned too late. Before I could protect myself fully, Chris swung brutally, the rock crashing against my temple with terrifying force. A blinding flash, then darkness consumed me entirely. When consciousness returned, it was fragmented, painful, distant voices echoing vaguely above me. "Make it believable." Brandon's voice trembled anxiously. "It has to look like the suspect attacked him." "Just keep digging," Chris snapped urgently. Soil hit my chest heavily, cold panic gripping me. They weren't just leaving me. They were burying me alive, methodically covering their crime. I struggled desperately, gasping weakly beneath the oppressive weight, dirt, and betrayal pressing heavily upon my chest. I felt an overwhelming wave of despair and shock. These weren't mere colleagues. These were men I'd trusted, stood beside through countless operations. How had I failed to see their betrayal coming? Even through the crushing fear, a persistent thought pierced my mind. David. Had he intentionally placed us together? Had he sensed the hostility brewing beneath the surface and deliberately allowed it to escalate? If so, why? I fought desperately against suffocation, my heart screaming in rage at the realization I might have been a pawn in a far more sinister game. As soil continued to pour over me, suffocating every breath, determination ignited sharply within my core. I wouldn't let it end here, reduced to a nameless casualty of petty envy and hidden agendas. In the suffocating darkness beneath layers of cold earth, I made myself a solemn promise. If I survived this, Brandon, Chris, and anyone else behind this betrayal, including David himself, would answer dearly. The soil pressed heavier, sealing me in darkness, yet my resolve burned brighter than ever. This wouldn't be my end. It would become their reckoning. Consciousness returned slowly and painfully, fractured moments merging gradually into awareness. The suffocating weight of the soil was abruptly lifted, replaced by cold night air slicing sharply into my lungs. Rough hands grasped my shoulders, pulling me swiftly upward, out from the shallow grave. I gasped violently, coughing out dirt and desperate betrayal. Blinking in the stark beam of powerful flashlights, my vision cleared enough to see Director David standing impassively, arms folded, watching me with chilling detachment. Around him stood the Bureau's elite tactical unit, stern and silent, their faces masked by professional stoicism. "Easy, Adam," David said coolly, his voice void of genuine concern. "You're safe now." I stared up at him, heart racing, suspicion surging fiercely through my veins. "You knew exactly where to find me," I rasped bitterly. "You were tracking me this entire time?" David didn't flinch, his expression unreadable, a careful mask perfected through decades of leadership. "Yes, we had surveillance on you since this morning. I suspected Brandon and Chris would try something desperate, but I needed them to make their move. You allowed them to bury me alive?" My voice shook with controlled rage. "Adam, sacrifices are inevitable in this war," David replied, chillingly calm. "You've seen how corrupt the Bureau has become, filled with privilege and incompetence. Brandon and Chris were merely symptoms. Tonight gave me precisely the justification required to remove them permanently." His words struck me like a blow. I struggled upright, leaning weakly against the ambulance that had arrived quietly at the scene. "And what about Brandon and Chris? What happens to them now?" "They've already been detained. Official charges of attempted murder and obstruction of justice are pending," David responded methodically, his tone devoid of emotion. "Their careers and freedom are finished." The satisfaction in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Yet beneath that victory I sensed another layer, a hidden agenda, darker and deeper. "What else aren't you telling me?" I demanded sharply, watching his eyes closely for the slightest betrayal. David hesitated just long enough for me to catch it, a brief flicker of vulnerability before it vanished behind his careful composure. "The Bureau needs radical reform. Tonight was the first step toward cleansing the ranks. But it's far bigger than Brandon or Chris. Powerful figures have shielded incompetence here for years." Then realization struck me sharply, memories connecting in a sudden flash. David's son, Michael, had recently completed his academy training, poised for a prime position in the Bureau. A sinking feeling gripped me. This wasn't just about rooting out corruption. It was about clearing the path, removing obstacles for Michael's swift ascension through the ranks. This was never purely about corruption, was it? I accused coldly. You're paving the way for Michael, your own son. David's expression hardened instantly, his eyes growing dangerously cold. Be careful, Adam, he warned softly, menace lacing his tone. Choose your battles wisely. You're valuable, but not irreplaceable. Our standoff was interrupted as several other bureau agents arrived, openly shocked by the brutal events. Their faces registered disbelief, suspicion, whispers flowing between them as they absorbed the sight of my battered, dirt-covered form. I could see clearly now the extent of David's manipulation. He had deliberately thrown me into a snake pit, gambling with my life, not just to expose Brandon and Chris, but also to solidify his power within the organization and secure his son's future. My survival was just collateral damage, an acceptable risk within his ruthless strategy. As David walked away into the shadows, issuing curt instructions to his team, I was left alone, cold and trembling, not just from physical trauma, but from deep betrayal. Colleagues glanced nervously my way, uncertain whether to approach or avoid me, their expressions tinged with pity, suspicion, and confusion. In that chilling moment, clarity washed over me like icy water. I'd survived being buried alive, only to emerge into a far more sinister landscape of manipulation and hidden agendas. The bureau I once believed in so deeply was rotten at its core, compromised by ambition, nepotism, and ruthless politics. But amidst the betrayal and despair, a fierce determination ignited within me. If David thought he could use me as a disposable pawn, he'd miscalculated gravely. From now on, I would dictate my own narrative. I'd uncover every secret, expose every hidden truth, and dismantle this corrupt web piece by piece, even if it meant risking everything I'd ever known. Because after tonight, I understood perfectly. I wasn't merely fighting corruption. I was fighting for my very soul. In the aftermath of my rescue, the Bureau felt more hostile and alien than ever. Brandon and Chris quickly vanished into obscurity, their arrests briefly scandalizing our ranks before fading quietly into bureaucratic silence. Justice had seemingly been served, yet the atmosphere was anything but settled. Colleagues who once considered me a reliable ally now walked on eggshells, their eyes wary, conversations halting abruptly as I approached. Every glance, every whisper behind closed doors became a subtle reminder of my status. Victim, survivor, and a disturbing symbol of the rot eating away at our organization. More troubling still was how effortlessly Director David had executed his ultimate plan. Michael, his son, was swiftly elevated to a prominent investigative position, his promotion skillfully disguised beneath the Bureau's narrative of restructuring. Observing Michael closely, I saw unmistakable glimpses of David's calculated ambition in every gesture, every practiced smile, and every carefully crafted word. Yet, amid this tense silence, I found purpose. Each night after hours, I meticulously gathered records. Internal emails, hidden memos, secretly recorded conversations, piecing together the ugly picture of systemic corruption. My trust had been irrevocably shattered, replaced by cold determination. The bureau I'd devoted my life to was unrecognizable, poisoned by ambition and manipulation. One late evening, as rain drummed gently against my office window, David entered silently, closing the door firmly behind him, a clear signal of confrontation. "You've been digging deeper, Adam," he remarked coolly, his gaze sharply assessing the mountain of evidence on my desk. I straightened, meeting his challenging eyes directly. "Uncovering uncomfortable truths." He took a cautious step forward, his tone lowering dangerously. "You know, secrets can be deadly weapons, especially in the wrong hands." "I think it's clear whose hands are dangerous here," I countered evenly, tension thickening the air. He paused, his expression unreadable, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "You survived once. I wouldn't push that luck further." David left without another word, but his threat lingered heavily in the silence that followed. It was clear my days at the bureau were numbered. A few mornings later, when I placed my resignation letter quietly on David's desk, he showed no surprise, merely offering a tight, satisfied smile. "Wise choice," he said softly, voice edged with triumph. "Maybe," I replied firmly, "but don't mistake this for surrender." The news of my departure spread quickly, eliciting muted shock. Some colleagues expressed quiet regret, others thinly veiled relief. A handful approached discreetly, voicing cautious support, their subdued encouragement revealing their own fears and disillusionment. It became clear I wasn't alone in recognizing the Bureau's decay. I was simply the first willing to step out from its shadows. On my final evening, packing my belongings into a simple cardboard box, I found a brief note slipped discreetly beneath my office door. It read simply, "You're not alone. When you're ready, reach out." No signature, just a private number. A spark ignited within me. A reminder that resistance and courage still existed, buried beneath layers of silence and fear. Leaving the Bureau's imposing headquarters for the last time, rain softly washing over the city, I felt both freedom and a profound sadness. Behind me lay betrayal, manipulation, and shattered illusions. Ahead stretched uncertainty, but also hope. In the weeks and months afterward, I carefully planned my next moves, reconnecting with trusted sources, discreet allies, and the mysterious voice behind that note. The corruption David represented wasn't limited to one man or one institution. It was systemic, rooted deeply within layers of power and privilege. As I stood on the city's edge one evening, lights shimmering softly across dark water, I finally saw my purpose clearly. My resignation wasn't defeat. It marked the start of a deeper battle, a fight to restore integrity to an institution that had lost its way. I knew the risks, the dangers, and the stakes involved. But more importantly, I understood that true justice required sacrifice, resilience, and unwavering courage. Taking a deep breath, feeling the night air fill my lungs, I accepted the challenge. The Bureau had once defined my purpose, but now that purpose had evolved into something far more meaningful. I wasn't simply fighting corruption anymore. I was fighting for truth itself, for the countless voices silenced by power. And with that quiet realization, for the first time since the cold, desperate night in the forest, I truly felt ready to face whatever came next. In the months that followed my dramatic exposure of corruption within the Bureau, my life took a purposeful, albeit challenging turn. The headlines had faded, but the impact continued reverberating through society, sparking intense public debate about institutional integrity and the need for transparency. Media outlets dissected every detail, and public pressure forced substantial reforms within the Bureau, reshaping its very foundations. Director David was officially charged, removed permanently, and faced federal prosecution. Michael's promising career was effectively dismantled, becoming another cautionary tale about unchecked ambition and nepotism. Justice, though delayed and imperfect, was finally tangible. Richard Evans, my steadfast partner throughout this journey, chose to step into the light once more. He took the helm of an independent watchdog organization dedicated to holding law enforcement accountable. Watching him thrive, witnessing his quiet determination become a powerful force for reform, inspired me deeply. For me personally, the scars left by betrayal were profound, yet so was the clarity they afforded. Recognizing that true healing meant actively participating in systemic change, I began collaborating with advocacy groups and think tanks, leveraging my painful experiences to educate others on corruption's hidden dangers. Speaking engagements became a new part of my reality, each lecture reinforcing the hard-earned truths about integrity, courage, and resilience. One evening, after delivering a speech at a community forum, a young trainee approached hesitantly. Your story made me reconsider joining the Bureau, she confessed quietly. But hearing you tonight, it gives me hope that things can change. I met her earnest gaze, seeing echoes of my younger self, full of idealism and determination. They can, I affirmed softly, but only if people like you stand firm and speak truth, even when it's painful. Gradually, public skepticism began shifting toward cautious optimism. The reforms within the Bureau were genuinely transformative, driven by relentless public oversight and transparency initiatives. Many former colleagues reached out privately, expressing regret or gratitude. Slowly but surely, trust began to rebuild. On a quiet afternoon, Richard and I met once more at the same downtown diner that had become our unofficial headquarters. Sipping coffee, Richard glanced at me thoughtfully. You ever miss it, the badge, the Bureau? Sometimes, I admitted, feeling the familiar ache of nostalgia. But what we're doing now, this matters. Maybe even more. Richard nodded solemnly, a small smile emerging. We made good on our promise, Adam. We exposed the rot, started the healing. Now it's time others carry that torch forward. Months later, standing on the balcony of my modest apartment, overlooking the city's glittering skyline, I felt the quiet peace I'd long sought. My life had changed irrevocably, but so had I. No longer bound by institutional expectations, I was freer, more authentic, and unquestionably more driven. I knew I could never return to the Bureau, but my purpose had grown beyond any one institution. My path was clearer now, defined by integrity, accountability, and unwavering commitment to truth. The wounds of betrayal were still there, permanent reminders of my journey. Yet alongside those scars was the profound realization that healing and redemption were possible, not just for individuals, but for entire systems. As I watched the lights shimmer softly across the dark water that night, the weight I'd carried so long finally lifted. I wasn't alone anymore. Richard, the young trainee, countless advocates, and silent allies, they formed a powerful community united by shared principles and courage. The Bureau had nearly destroyed me, but ultimately it had freed me, transforming my greatest pain into my most meaningful purpose. And with that quiet revelation, a fresh, resilient hope filled my heart. I was finally ready to embrace the future, whatever it might bring. Thank you all for watching this video. Please comment and let me know what you think about this story. Please like and subscribe to watch more great content on my channel.